The night she tried to leave, it was 3 in the morning, and the porch boards creaked under her feet just enough to wake me up. I had been sleeping light for weeks, the kind of sleep that isn't really sleep at all, just a man lying still with one ear open, like a farmer waiting for weather that might ruin everything. When I heard that sound, I didn't think. I just pulled on my jeans and walked to the window. She was standing at the edge of the porch in the cold dark, wearing that old olive jacket she always wore when she was about to do something hard. Her daughter Sophie was pressed against her side, half asleep, small sneakers on the wrong feet. Nora had a bag over one shoulder and her car keys in her fist, and she was standing completely still, like a woman convincing herself to take the first step off a cliff. I didn't call out to her. I just went downstairs and opened the front door. She spun around. The look on her face, I'll never forget it. Not guilt, not embarrassment, just exhaustion. The kind that lives all the way down in a person's bones. I said her name very quietly. Nora. She didn't answer. She just lifted her chin and tried to hold herself together in that way she always did, the way that made her look strong from a distance and absolutely heartbroken from close up. I said, "It's 3 in the morning." "I know," she said. "Sophie's shoes are on the wrong feet." Nora looked down. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I know that too," she whispered. I stepped back from the doorway and held it open. "Come inside," I said. "Whatever you're planning can wait until it's light." She didn't move for a long time, and when she finally did walk back through the door, she passed me close enough that I could feel how cold she'd already gotten standing out there, how long she'd been at the edge before I woke up. I think that was the moment I understood. Nora hadn't been packing to leave because things had gotten bad. She had been packing to leave because she had finally started to believe things might get good. And that terrified her more than anything. But let me take you back to where this all started, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. I'm Caleb Marsh. I'm 32 years old and I live in Harlow, a small town in eastern Oregon that most people have never heard of and most people who leave never come back to. I run a small contracting business, residential repairs, structural work, the occasional new build when someone has the money and the patience for it. My hands have looked like a construction worker's hands since I was 20 years old. Calluses on my palms. A scar across my right thumb from a table saw I was too confident around when I was young and stupid. I live in the house my grandfather built, which sounds better than it is. It needs work. It always needs work. That's fine. I like having something to fix. My life before Nora was quiet in the way that empty rooms are quiet. Not peaceful, just hollow. I worked early and late. I ate whatever was in the fridge. I answered the phone when it rang and didn't pick up when it didn't. I had a dog named Porter who slept on the kitchen floor and occasionally reminded me that other living things needed to eat. I wasn't unhappy, I just wasn't anything much. Some men can live like that for years and call it contentment. I had started to wonder if I was one of them. The woman who sent Nora to me was Patrice Cole, who ran the hardware store 2 blocks from the town square and knew approximately everyone in a 40-mile radius and their business. Patrice called me on a Wednesday morning in late September while I was on a roof in the rain patching a section of flashing that had been leaking since July. She said, "Caleb, I've got a woman here who needs a place to stay for a few weeks. She's got a little girl. She's good people, and she's in trouble. You've got that spare room downstairs doing nothing." I said, "Patrice, I'm on a roof." "I know. That room's still empty?" I said yes. "Good," Patrice said, and hung up. That's how it worked with Patrice. The conversation happened the way she decided it would happen, and you figured out how you felt about it later. Nora arrived that same afternoon in a car that made a sound like it was apologizing every time she accelerated. She drove into my gravel driveway, and the first thing I noticed was that she sat in the car for almost 2 full minutes before she got out. I watched from the window. I wasn't trying to spy. I just wanted to understand what I was dealing with. A woman who needs 2 minutes to talk herself into getting out of a car is a woman carrying something heavy. I've learned you don't rush someone like that. You let them find the ground under their feet before you ask them to walk on it. When she finally got out, she had Sophie on her hip, the little girl's face buried against her neck, and a duffel bag over her shoulder that had a stuffed rabbit tied to the handle by its ear. Nora herself was wearing jeans and a white button-down shirt that was slightly too big for her, and her honey-brown hair was loose and falling across her cheek in the wind. She looked like someone who had been running for a while and was not entirely sure she was allowed to stop. I walked out and met her on the porch. "Caleb Marsh," I said. "Nora Callahan," she said back. Her voice was steady. I gave her credit for that. "Patrice said you needed a place for a few weeks." She shifted Sophie on her hip. Her jaw was set. "I know this isn't ideal. If it's too much trouble, I can—" "It's not too much trouble," I said. "Come see the room." She looked at me like she was trying to figure out the catch, like she had been told by enough people in her life that nothing came without a price that she now ran the calculation automatically, looking for the hidden cost in every open door. I recognized that look, not because I'd felt it myself. My life had been hard in different ways, but because I had watched my mother look like that for most of my childhood. After my father left and the world became a series of offers she wasn't sure she could trust, I just stood back and let her walk inside. The spare room was small. A single bed, a wooden dresser, a window that looked out over the backyard where the old oak tree stood. I had put fresh sheets on that morning because Patrice had given me enough warning to at least do that. On the sill, there was a clay pot with a small succulent that had been there since my grandmother's time and had somehow survived everything. Sophie looked at the plant with enormous interest the moment she walked in. She wiggled down from Nora's hip and toddled over to the window, pressing both small hands to the glass. "Mama," she said. "Bird?" There was indeed a bird sitting in the oak tree. A fat gray one that looked very self-important. Nora watched her daughter, and something in her face softened just slightly. Then she looked at me, and the careful blankness came back. "What would you need from me in return?" she asked. "I'm not taking charity." I leaned against the doorframe. "I have a side business managing a few rental properties downtown. Maintenance scheduling, tenant calls, invoicing. I've been doing all of it by hand, and I'm 4 months behind on everything. If you can manage the paperwork side for a few weeks, we're even." She studied me. "You need an office manager. I need someone who can read my handwriting, which my doctor says is technically a medical condition." The corner of her mouth moved. Just barely. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. She took the room. The first few days, she was like a person trying very hard to take up no space. She woke before I did and made coffee and left mine on the counter before I came down, like she was paying a toll in advance. She kept Sophie quiet in a way that broke my heart a little, the careful, practiced way she'd say, "Shh, let's be quiet for Mr. Marsh," in a voice that suggested Sophie had been taught from very young that their presence was a burden to be managed. My house wasn't loud. It just happened to be quiet because I lived alone. Porter thumped his tail against the floor every time Sophie came near him, and within 24 hours she had renamed him Bunny, which he seemed to accept with dignified resignation. On the third morning, I came downstairs at 6 and found Nora at the kitchen table with my entire stack of rental property folders spread out in front of her. She had a pen behind her ear and was cross-referencing 2 different invoices with the focused, slightly alarmed expression of a person who has discovered a filing system built by someone with no system at all. She looked up. "These folders aren't organized by property. They're organized by how much you dislike the tenant." I poured my coffee. "That's not true. You have 3 separate folders for a man named Dennis. Dennis is a complicated situation." She picked up a crumpled receipt that appeared to have been used at some point as a coaster. "Caleb. This is from 8 months ago." I sat down across from her. "This is why I need help." She looked at me for a moment. Then she turned back to the folders and said, very calmly, "I'll have this sorted by Thursday." I didn't tell her she didn't have to. I didn't tell her to take it easy. I just said, "Thank you." And I meant it the way one adult means it to another, not as a favor to someone who owed me, but as genuine gratitude from someone who needed exactly what she was doing. I think that was when she first started to relax. Just slightly. The way a door that's been jammed finally shifts a millimeter in its frame. I learned about Derek in pieces. The way you learn most things about a person who doesn't fully trust you yet. Not in one conversation, but in small slips, in things said sideways. He had been her boyfriend for 2 years. He had also been her employer. They'd worked at the same property management company in Portland, which was why, when things ended between them, she lost her job as well as him, and the apartment they'd been sharing, and the life she'd built around a person who turned out to be exactly as unreliable as she'd been afraid to believe. Sophie was 4. Derek was not Sophie's father. She'd had Sophie from a relationship before him, and Derek had known that going in and seemed fine with it right up until he wasn't. Which is the kind of fine that isn't fine at all. The part that made my jaw tighten wasn't that he had ended things. People end relationships. The part was that when he ended them, he had also called their landlord and their employer and, she said this last part quietly, looking at the table, told people that she had taken money from the company accounts, that she had been stealing from clients. She hadn't. She said it the same way I imagine anyone says a true thing they've been forced to repeat too many times. Looking straight at you, no performance in it, just the flat certainty of someone who is tired of having to defend what didn't happen. I believe you, I said. She went very still. You don't have to explain further, I said. I believe you. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once and went back to the folder she was sorting. But her shoulders dropped half an inch. Some weight she'd been holding shifted somewhere else. Derek had filed for an informal custody review. Not a full custody case, just enough paperwork to create uncertainty. Just enough to keep her off balance, which I was coming to understand was his primary skill set. He had no legal standing. Sophie wasn't his child. There was no formal guardianship, nothing that gave him real ground. But thin wasn't the same as harmless. A man with money and time can turn a baseless claim into an exhausting one. The weeks passed in a rhythm that surprised me with how natural it felt. Nora ran the rental property side of my business with an efficiency that made me quietly ashamed of how badly I'd been managing it. She reorganized the invoicing system, set up automated reminders for tenants, and had a 30-minute phone call with Dennis that somehow resulted in him paying 2 months of back rent and apologizing. I don't know what she said to him. I didn't ask. I just found the check on the counter with a post-it note that said Dennis. She had drawn a small star next to his name. I stood there looking at that star for longer than made sense. Sophie followed Porter around the yard in the afternoons like a very determined expedition leader. She had graduated from calling him Bunny to calling him Mr. Bunny, which Porter seemed to feel was the appropriate level of respect. She drew pictures at the kitchen table with whatever she could find. Crayons, ink pens, a highlighter that she discovered in the junk drawer and used to create what she called a portrait of a horse, which looked more like a fluorescent rectangle with legs. I taped it to the refrigerator. Nora saw it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You don't have to do that." And I said, "I wanted to." She looked at me and then looked away, and I could tell the simple kindness of it had caught her somewhere she wasn't ready for. I started finding small reasons to come home in the middle of the day. I told myself it was to check on the house, to let Porter out, to pick up something I'd forgotten. All of which were true and none of which were the real reason. The real reason was that the house had stopped feeling hollow when Nora was in it, and I was not yet ready to examine that too closely. The trouble arrived on a Thursday evening in the second week of October. I had come in from a job site with mud on my boots and sawdust in my hair, and Nora was standing at the kitchen counter staring at her phone with the expression I was starting to recognize. Not panic, just a very contained version of it, the kind that keeps itself quiet so the child in the next room doesn't feel it. She said his name without me asking. "Derek, what happened?" "He's telling people in Portland I took Sophie without his permission, that I fled. His family has a lawyer." She set the phone face down on the counter and pressed her hands flat on either side of it. "He has no legal claim on Sophie. He was never her guardian, but he has money and I don't. And he knows exactly how to make something that isn't true sound like something that requires a formal response." I put down my tool bag. "What kind of lawyer?" "Family law. He's trying to claim he has a right to be part of Sophie's life because they were together for 2 years and she called him Dad." I kept my voice even. "Did she?" Nora's eyes closed briefly. She did. For a while. Before she learned not to. The thing about that sentence was the weight at the end of it. Before she learned not to. A 4-year-old learning not to call someone dad because it made things worse. I felt something harden in my chest that I didn't let show on my face. I have a lawyer, I said. He does mostly property work, but he knows people. His name is Frank Sutton. Nora shook her head. I'm not your problem, Caleb. I said, I didn't say you were a problem. You've already done more than enough for us. I looked at her steadily. Do you want to handle this alone because you actually think you'll do better alone, or because you're afraid of owing someone else something? She opened her mouth. Closed it. The honest answer was right there in her face. Call Frank, I said. Tell him I sent you. That's all. What I didn't tell her was that I had already called Frank the same night and asked him to pull together a response. That I'd asked what it would cost to respond formally and preemptively, to make it absolutely clear that Nora was not alone, that there was someone standing next to her, and that any legal maneuver targeting her had to account for that. Frank gave me a number. I said fine. I didn't tell Nora. Not yet. What I told her was this. Stay. Just stay for now. Give Frank a week to look at everything. Don't make any decisions from fear. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, Why are you doing this? I thought about the right answer. There were several true ones. I chose the simplest. Because you're good at your work and you're a good mother and you deserve to have someone stand next to you for a change instead of waiting around to see if you'll fall. Her eyes went bright. She didn't cry. Nora was not, I was learning, someone who cried easily. She had rerouted that energy somewhere else a long time ago, into competence, into planning, into making sure Sophie only ever felt solid ground under her feet. But her eyes went bright, and she looked away, and the set of her jaw got very tight for a moment. Thank you, she said finally. She said it like it cost her something to receive. Frank filed the formal response the following week. The language was calm and precise and made it very clear that any attempt to establish informal custody rights over a child to whom you have no legal relationship, based solely on cohabitation, while simultaneously pursuing a false fraud claim against the child's mother, was a course of action with significant legal consequences of its own. Derek's attorney went quiet for 4 days. I should have known the quiet meant something. On a Saturday afternoon, Derek showed up. I was in the driveway fixing the brake line on Nora's car, which had been clicking for 2 weeks in a way I didn't like, when a silver sedan I didn't recognize turned in off the road. I stayed where I was. The man who got out was mid-30s, the kind of handsome that came with a good haircut and very little character underneath it. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than my week's earnings, and he looked at my property the way people look at things that confirm what they already thought about someone. He didn't see me at first. He walked toward the porch. I straightened up. Can I help you? I said. He turned. He looked me over. The grease on my hands, the work boots, the house behind me with the porch that needed repainting, and I watched him decide in about 3 seconds that I wasn't worth being careful with. I'm looking for Nora Callahan, he said. I'm a friend. The word friend landed flat. She's not available right now, I said. He smiled the way people smile when they're being patient with an obstacle. I drove 4 hours. Can you just let her know I'm here? I can tell her you stopped by. She'll get back to you through her attorney. The smile tightened. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk to her. And see Sophie. Sophie's not available either. He looked at me with open contempt now. The restraint had run out. Look, I don't know who you are or what she's told you, but she has a history of— I held up one hand. I've heard what you're saying she has a history of. From Patrice Cole. From Frank Sutton. From Nora herself. He paused. I've also read the response Frank filed. And I know exactly why you drove 4 hours the week after a formal legal response landed on your attorney's desk. So you can say what you actually came to say, or you can get back in your car. But you are not walking through that door. His jaw tightened. This is none of your business. She lives here, I said, so it's my business. For a moment he just stood there, doing the math, trying to figure out if I was bluffing, if I was something he could move. I just looked at him the way I look at a structural problem, assessing it calmly, waiting to see where it gives. He gave first. He got back in the car and drove slowly, the way men do when they want to seem like they're leaving by choice. I watched until his taillights disappeared down the road. Then I went back to fixing Nora's brake line. I didn't slam anything. I didn't pace. My hands stayed steady. When she came out 20 minutes later, I told her he'd been there. I told her what I'd said. I didn't inflate it. I didn't make it more dramatic than it was. She listened without interrupting, and then sat down on the porch step and looked at her hands. "He came here," she said quietly. "He did." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Most people at this point would ask themselves what they got themselves into." I tightened the last bolt and looked up at her. "I'm not most people." She looked at me for a long time. "I know," she said. "That's what scares me." I understood then what was really happening. It wasn't that she thought I would fail her. It was that she was starting to believe I wouldn't, and she didn't know what to do with that. She had built her whole architecture around expecting to be left, expecting the ground to shift, expecting that any safety was temporary. And here was the ground holding steady, and it felt more terrifying than the falling she already knew how to survive. That was the night she packed the bag. She packed it and then stood on the porch at 3 in the morning. I don't know how long before I heard the boards creak, trying to make herself walk to the car, trying to leave before she could be left. The night she came back through the door, I made tea. I didn't ask questions. I just made tea and put Sophie back to bed myself, carrying her up the stairs while she muttered drowsily about Mr. Bunny. And when I came back down, Nora was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug, staring at nothing. I sat across from her. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, "I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to," I said. She looked up. "I wasn't leaving because things were bad." She stopped. "I was leaving because they were starting to feel good. And I don't know how to trust that. I don't know how to believe something good stays." I said, "That's okay." "It's not okay. I'm treating you like you're about to disappoint me when you haven't done anything wrong." I said, "You're not treating me like I'm about to disappoint you. You're treating me like every person before me who already did. There's a difference, and I can wait for you to figure out that I'm not them." She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She said, "You're very calm about all of this." I smiled. "Nora, I fix broken things for a living. I'm not frightened of a process that takes time." 3 days later, she stopped apologizing for being there. I noticed it before she did, the morning she came down and just poured her coffee without saying sorry for using the last of the milk, without preemptively thanking me for the shelter, without managing her presence like it was something that needed constant justifying. She just poured her coffee and sat down and pulled her laptop open and started working. It was such a small thing, and it was everything. The legal matter with Derek resolved more quietly than either of us expected. Frank's formal response had clearly communicated the cost of pursuing it further, and Derek's family attorney apparently had better uses for their time. A final notice arrived 3 weeks later. The informal inquiry had been discontinued. No more paperwork. No more late evening phone calls. No more silver sedans in the driveway. Nora read the letter twice, set it down, and said, "Well, no celebration, no tears. Just a woman who had been fighting long enough that the end of the fight felt more like silence than victory." But I watched something change in her after that. Not all at once. That wasn't how Nora worked. Slowly. The way light comes back after the longest nights of winter. So gradually you only notice it when suddenly there's an hour more of it than there was before. She started leaving her coffee cup on the same shelf as mine instead of tucked away in the corner cabinet where she'd kept it. She stopped apologizing when she used the last of something and just added it to the grocery list. She started calling the rental property tenants by their first names when she gave me updates, the way you do when people stop being strangers to you and start being people. Sophie started calling me Kay, which was not short for Caleb in any sensible way but which stuck immediately and which Porter seemed to think was also his name, since he came running whenever anyone said it. One evening in November, I came in from a job to find Nora standing on a step stool in the kitchen, trying to replace the light bulb in the overhead fixture that had been flickering for a month. She had a new bulb in one hand and was stretching on the tips of her toes, not quite reaching. I said, "You could have waited." She said, "It's been flickering for 4 weeks." I said, "I was going to fix it." She said, "I know. I did it anyway." I stood there looking at her. The step stool, the determination, the way she'd gone and found the light bulb herself rather than waiting to be helped, and I thought that this was exactly it. This was who she was. She didn't need someone to fix things for her. She needed someone who was fine with her fixing them herself and was still standing there when she was done. I held the base of the step stool steady while she finished. She clicked the bulb in, and the kitchen filled with clean, steady light. She stepped down and looked up at the fixture with quiet satisfaction. She said, "I like fixing things." I said, "I know. That's one of the things I like about you." She turned and looked at me. We were very close in the small kitchen. She was still holding the burnt-out bulb in her hand, and there was a smudge of dust on her cheek from reaching into the fixture, and the light was warm and yellow, and the house smelled like the dinner she'd had on the stove. She said, "I used to think that loving someone again would feel like going off a cliff." I said, "Does it?" She thought about it. She said, "It feels more like finding solid ground I didn't know was under me the whole time." I reached up and brushed the dust from her cheek. She went very still. Then she kissed me. Not tentatively, not with the careful hedging of someone unsure they're allowed, but fully, the way you kiss someone when you've chosen them, with both hands settled like you're not planning on going anywhere. When she pulled back, her eyes were open and clear and looking straight at me. I said, "There you are." She laughed, surprised. The sound filled the kitchen like it had been missing for a long time and had finally found its way back. That winter was the quietest I'd had in years, and also the fullest. Nora stayed. It stopped being a temporary arrangement, and we both knew it, and neither of us needed to say so, because it was in every small thing. Her coat on the hook next to mine, Sophie's drawings spreading across the refrigerator like a gallery that updated weekly, the sound of another person's breathing in the house at night, warm and real and continuous. She started taking on remote bookkeeping clients of her own. 2, then 3, then 5, until she had a real client list that had nothing to do with Derek, nothing to do with anyone's charity, and nothing to do with me except that she did her work at the kitchen table and I occasionally refilled her coffee without being asked. She got a business email. She got a small sign made for the window. Her name, the word consulting, nothing else. And the morning it arrived, she stood looking at it for a long moment before she let me hang it. Patrice Cole stopped by and said, "You've done something to this house. It doesn't look hollow anymore." With Patrice, it was usually something else she meant. One afternoon in early December, Sophie appeared at my elbow while I was measuring a window frame and tugged on my sleeve and said, "Kay, do you love my mom?" I looked down at her. She was holding the stuffed rabbit and looking at me with the absolute unguarded directness that only very young children have before they learn to frame questions carefully, before they understand that some answers cost something. I put down my tape measure. "Yeah," I said, "I do." She thought about this for a moment. Then she nodded seriously, like she'd been reviewing a proposal and had reached her decision. "Okay," she said, and walked away. That evening I told Nora. She laughed until her eyes ran. Then she got quiet and looked at me across the kitchen table with that expression she had now. Not guarded, not performing, not braced, just open and tired and warm and real. She said, "I used to tell myself that if someone ever actually stayed, it would feel like a trap. Some kind of trick I hadn't figured out yet." "And?" I said. "And it doesn't," she said. "It just feels like home." I have thought about that word a lot since she said it. Home. What it means to someone who had learned to carry their home on their back because they stopped believing it could exist anywhere permanent. What it cost to put it down. What it takes to trust that the floor will hold. Nora had been told so many times in so many ways that she was too much. Too complicated, too cautious, too self-reliant, too difficult to love consistently. Derek had said it with his silence and his paperwork and his 4-hour drive designed to intimidate rather than repair. The world had said it with job losses and lease endings and the specific cruelty of systems that punish people for not having enough margin to absorb the damage other people cause. But the truth I had known from the first morning I watched her sort my filing system with a coffee cup at her elbow, and a 4-year-old drawing fluorescent horses at her feet, was that Nora was only too much for people who had already decided they were going to leave. For someone willing to stay, she was exactly enough. She had thought I'd walk away when things got hard. She had spent years building contingency plans around that certainty, packing bags in the dark, standing at the edge of porches at 3 in the morning, practicing exits before anyone could force her to take one. She didn't know that hard was the only language I had ever really spoken, that I had spent my whole life in houses that needed fixing, in structures that other people had given up on, learning to look at something broken and find the thing in it that was still sound, still standing, still worth every hour of work. She was worth the work. She still is. This past October, on a morning when the oak tree in the backyard had gone completely gold and the cold was settling in at the windows and Sophie was in the kitchen teaching Porter a new trick he was politely pretending to learn, Nora came and stood next to me on the porch where I was having coffee and watching the light come up over the fields. She leaned against my arm without saying anything. After a moment, she said, "I'm not scared anymore." I said, "Of what?" She said, "Of any of it." I looked at her. She was looking at the tree with its gold leaves, and the yard, and the old barn at the back, that still needed the east wall resided before winter, and she looked like a person who had finally stopped counting the exits and started looking at what was inside instead. I said, "Good." She turned and looked at me. Her eyes were steady and warm and absolutely certain. She said, "I used to wonder what it would feel like if someone loved me through the hard parts, instead of just waiting to see if the hard parts would end." I said, "And?" She said, "Now I know." I kissed her in the October morning while the light was gold on the fields, and the oak tree stood steady behind us, and Porter's nails clicked on the porch boards as he came to join us anyway, and inside the house Sophie was singing something slightly off-key and very loud. Some people find love when everything is calm and the timing is right. We found it when the brake line was clicking and the files were 4 months behind and there was a silver sedan in the driveway and a bag already packed in the dark. I wouldn't have had it any other way. Because the truth is, I didn't fall in love with Nora Callahan in spite of the hard parts. I fell in love with her inside them. In the early mornings when she showed up already working before I came downstairs, in the way she held Sophie with one arm while she sorted files with the other like she had learned long ago that the two things had to happen simultaneously or neither of them would get done. In the way she looked at me the first time I said "I believe you," like those 3 words had been said so rarely she was still figuring out whether she could trust them. She thought I'd walk away when things got hard. She built an entire way of living around that certainty, and I don't blame her for it. She had learned it the honest way, which is the most expensive kind of lesson there is. But what she couldn't have known standing on my porch with her bag and her keys and her child's shoes on the wrong feet was that I had been built out of hard, that the men in my family fixed things and the women endured things and I had inherited both, and somewhere in between I had become the kind of person who does not turn away from difficulty. Nora was cracked down the middle when she arrived. So was I in my quieter way. 2 people living inside their own particular silences. And sometimes the most extraordinary thing in a life is not the moment everything becomes easy. It's the morning you look across the kitchen table at a person who has seen the hard parts of you and is still there, coffee in hand, working beside you, not despite the difficulty but simply past it, and you understand that this, exactly this, is what it was supposed to feel like all along.